Most real Android apps have more than one activity or screen. To share data between the activities, you can follow a couple of different strategies. Let's say that the user touches an item in a list or a grid. Right now, I'm simply registering the event and reporting which item the user selected. But in a finished app, I might want to pass that data to another activity for displaying detailed information or otherwise processing the information. To navigate to another activity, you use an intent object. The intent has information about the activity that you want to display, but it also has something called an extras field, which is an implementation of a bundle, a collection of key value pairs. The bundle's keys are always strings. The associated values are limited to simple types, primitive numeric values and strings, or arrays of these types. You can't pass primitive Boolean values in a bundle, though, so these are typically represented as integers with values of 0 or 1. You can pass URIs, or Uniform Resource Identifiers, not in the extras bundle, but as the intent's data. The detailed activity can then receive that information in the extras and use the information to retrieve the selected data from a data store and display it. So I'll start in my data item adapter class, where I already have code in place to listen for and react when the user selects an item from the list. When the user does that, I want to navigate to a detail activity. So I'll create the new activity in the app module. In the project window, I'll right-click on the app module and choose New, Activity, and I'll make it a really simple, empty activity. I'll set the name of the activity to Detail Activity, and I'll accept the layout name of Activity Detail. And I'll click Finish. And that creates the new activity and its associated XML layout file, which has a root element of relative layout. Now, when I created the activity, Android Studio automatically registered that activity in the application manifest, but it didn't add all of the information I need. I want to be able to navigate back to the main activity easily, so I'm going to add a parent activity name attribute and set it to main activity, prefixed with a dot. That will handle backward navigation in newer versions of Android. If you want to be backward compatible with older versions of Android, also add a child element named metadata and set a name and a value. The name is a constant of parent activity from Android.support, and the value once again points to the main activity class. So now I have my detail activity and I'm ready to navigate to it. I'll go back to my data item adapter to my click listener. I'm going to comment out the toast message. I won't need that anymore. And instead, I'll start here. I'll create a string variable named item ID, and I'll get its value by calling item.getItemID. Now, right now, all of my items have null IDs, and that's because that's how they're provided in the data provider. I'm going to make a change here in the data item class, in the constructor method when I pass in the values. I'll place the cursor right up here, and I'll ask whether the item ID that's passed in is null. I'll start with if item ID equals null, and if that's true, I'll say item ID equals uuid.randomuuid.toString. So essentially I'm saying if I'm creating a new object and it doesn't have a universal unique ID, assign it right now. And now in the adapter class, I'll always have a unique ID to pass between activities. Next, I'll create an intent object. I'll pass in the current context and the name of the class I want to navigate to, followed by .class. I'm not passing in an instance of the activity, I'm just telling the framework which class to use. Next, I'm going to pass an extra value, and this will be the ID that uniquely identifies that data item. I'll say intent.putExtra. There are two arguments that are required. The first is the key, which is always a string. I'm going to create a constant that I'll name item ID key. That constant doesn't exist yet. I'll come back to it. And then I'll pass in item ID. And then I'll call mcontext.startActivity, and I'll pass in the intent. And that launches the activity. Now I'll come back to that constant. I'll place the cursor in its declaration, and I'll use an intention action and create the constant field item ID as a member of data item adapter. And I'll set its value to item ID key. That value can be anything you want. By using the constant in both this and the detail activity, you'll know you're working with the same data. Make sure to change this to a public constant so the entire application can get to the value. So now in the onBindViewHolder method, I've handled the event, and I'm sending the information that's needed to the detail activity. I'll close up this code, and now I'll go to my detail activity class. In the onCreate method, I can get to the intent that launched the activity by calling the method getIntent. And from the intent, I can call getExtras, and from there, I can get to any of the extra values that were passed in. So here I'll create a string that I'll once again name item ID, and I'll get its value from getIntent.getExtras.getString. And then I'll pass in that constant that I created in the adapter, which is dataItemAdapter.itemIdKey. Now I can use that ID to get the selected data item from the data store, which in my example is the sample data provider. Remember, I had created this static map named DataItemMap, and I'll use it now. I'll create a data item, I'll name it item, and I'll get its value from sampleDataProvider.dataItemMap.get, and I'll pass in the item ID. If you are working with an SQL-like database or any other data store that respects primary keys, the strategy would be much the same. Finally, I'll use a toast message and say received item, and then I'll display the item name with item.getItemName. So in the receiving activity, you get the intent, from there you get the extras, and from there you get the extra value. Then you use that value to go get the complex data you need from the persistent data store. And we're ready to test the app. Now, when I select an item from the list, I go to the detail activity and I see the toast message, received the item. And because I had set up the parent activity relationship, I automatically get the up button up there on the toolbar. And when I click it, I return to the main screen. I'll choose another item and see that it was received correctly, and then I'll go back again. So now I'm successfully passing just enough data from the main activity to the detail activity, and I can use that very small amount of information to go get all the information I need in the new activity.